Lyra had lived for 473 years, and in all that time, she had never felt as alone as she did now. The morning light filtered through the broken canopy of what used to be the great forest of Aelendor, casting weak shadows on the cracked earth below. She stood at the edge of the withered trees, her silver hair falling past her shoulders like strands of moonlight, her blue eyes reflecting the sadness of her dying world. Behind her, 2 small dragons rested against the ancient oak that had served as her shelter for the past 6 months. Ember, the golden one with scales that shimmered like fire, lifted her head as Lyra approached. Ash, darker and sleeker, opened one intelligent eye to watch her mistress. These 2 dragons were all she had left. The rest of her kind had scattered across the cosmos generations ago, seeking worlds that were not dying, seeking futures that held hope. Lyra had stayed behind, refusing to abandon her homeland no matter how broken it became. She was a guardian of the old ways, a keeper of ancient magic that few still remembered or valued. Her people called her stubborn. Her enemies called her foolish. She called herself devoted. The drought had started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Over the course of 50 years, the rains came less frequently. The great rivers that had flowed through Aelendor since the beginning of time grew thinner and thinner. The massive crystalline structures that powered the elf civilization began to lose their luminescence. One by one, the cities were abandoned. The great libraries were sealed. The healing temples fell silent. Lyra had watched it all happen with growing desperation in her heart, even as she maintained a calm and steady exterior. She was the last guardian, and guardians did not break, no matter how much their world crumbled around them. She reached down and ran her fingers across Ember's snout. The dragon purred, a sound like distant thunder, and Lyra felt some of the weight lift from her shoulders. These creatures had come to her 3 years ago, barely more than hatchlings wandering lost and hungry through the ruins of the eastern province. Dragons were rare now, too. The breeding grounds had become too hostile. The magic that sustained them had begun to fade along with everything else. Lyra had taken them in without hesitation, sharing her meager food supplies, teaching them to hunt in the half-dead forests, forming bonds that transcended simple ownership or companionship. She settled down between the 2 dragons, and they both curled around her, their bodies providing warmth as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Lyra pulled out a small crystal device from her bag, one of the few technological remnants of her civilization that still functioned. It displayed a map of Aelendor, though most of the map now glowed red, indicating dangerous or inhospitable zones. Only small pockets of blue remained, areas where the air was still breathable, where water could still be found. Lyra's current location was one of those blue pockets, but she knew it would not last. The experts, back when there were still experts, had predicted another 5 years before even these refugees became uninhabitable. 5 years. That was all the time she had. Lyra had spent those years alone with her dragons, learning new survival techniques, documenting the old magical knowledge before it was lost forever, and quietly waiting for either salvation or the end. She did not expect salvation anymore. She had made peace with that. But the waiting, the endless waiting, wore on her spirit like constant rain wearing away stone. That night, as Ember and Ash slept deeply, Lyra sat awake watching the stars. The sky above Aelendor had turned a sickly gray during the day, but at night the stars were still visible, and they still held their ancient beauty. She wondered what her ancestors would think of her now, this proud warrior reduced to scavenging for food and water, living in the dirt like an animal. But then she remembered her duty. She was not living for herself anymore. She was living for the memory of what Aelendor had been, for the history of her people, for the 2 creatures sleeping beside her who depended on her for their survival. A sound made her tense. It was not the usual sounds of the forest, the low creaks and groans of dying wood, the distant calls of whatever animals still survived in these lands. This was something different, something mechanical and purposeful. Lyra's hand went to the sword at her side, an old weapon forged with ancient magic that still held its edge despite the centuries. She woke Ember and Ash with a gentle touch, and both dragons were instantly alert, their eyes scanning the darkness with predatory focus. The sound grew louder. It was definitely mechanical, definitely approaching. Lyra had heard stories, old legends passed down through generations of humans from the stars who had visited Aelendor thousands of years ago. The stories painted them as demons, as destroyers, as creatures whose very touch corrupted and withered the land. For centuries, the elf kingdoms had forbidden any contact with humans or their technology. The policy was so old and so deeply ingrained that most elves born in recent generations barely believed the stories at all. But Lyra believed, and she was terrified. She gathered her few possessions quickly, moving with the efficiency of someone who had practiced emergency evacuations many times before. Ember and Ash stuck close to her, their smaller frames allowing them to slip through the undergrowth more easily than larger creatures could. They made their way to higher ground, to the ridge that overlooked the forest clearing where she had made her camp. If these visitors were hostile, Lyra wanted the advantage of high ground and escape routes. Through the trees, she saw it. A massive ship, easily the size of the old government buildings in the capital city, descended through the clouds with a grace that belied its enormous size. Its hull was sleek and metallic, covered with lights and markings that Lyra did not recognize. The landing jets engaged with a subtle hum that made her bones vibrate, and the ship settled into the clearing with the precision of a master craftsman, placing a final piece. Lyra crouched low, hidden behind a massive fallen tree, with Ember and Ash pressed tight against her on either side. She had not survived 473 years by being reckless. She had not kept these dragons alive by taking unnecessary risks. She would wait, watch, and observe before making any decisions. The ancient laws of the Guardians taught patience above all else. Patience and vigilance would tell her whether these visitors came to help or to harm. The ship's door began to open slowly, revealing a ramp that descended to the forest floor. Silhouettes appeared in the light emanating from within the vessel. Lyra's grip tightened on her sword. Whatever happened next, she was ready. She had to be ready. The fate of Aelendor, the fate of her dragons might very well depend on the choices she made in the next few moments. And Lyra had always been very, very good at making the right choices. Captain Victoria Okonkwo had been exploring distant worlds for 12 years, and in that time, she had learned to trust her instincts above almost everything else. Her crew sometimes joked that she could sense danger before it arrived, and opportunity before it was visible. Today, those instincts were working overtime. Aelendor had been marked on the star charts as a dead world, a place where some advanced civilization had once flourished and then mysteriously vanished. Most exploration captains would have passed by without a second glance. But Victoria had always been drawn to mysteries. She descended the ramp with 3 of her best officers, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, who served as her weapons and tactics specialist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the team's biologist and environmental expert, and communications officer Hayes, a young woman with an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. They moved carefully through the forest, their instruments scanning for any signs of life or danger. The readings were strange. The environment was deeply damaged, with radiation levels higher than expected and atmospheric composition shifted by decades of degradation. Yet there were small pockets of relative stability, areas where the air was still breathable and where water could still support life. Victoria noticed something that made her raise her hand, signaling the team to stop. In the dust at her feet were tracks, not human tracks and not from any animals she recognized from the database. They were large, with a pattern that suggested intelligence in their maker. Whatever had left these tracks was powerful and deliberate in its movements. She knelt down and examined them more closely, noting the recent age of the impressions. Whatever had made them had passed through this area no more than a few hours ago. Dr. Vasquez moved to her side, her scientific curiosity overriding caution as it usually did. She pulled out a small scanner and ran it over the tracks, her eyes widening slightly at the readings. She leaned close to Victoria and whispered something about scaled creatures, possibly reptilian, definitely organic. Victoria nodded slowly. Reptilians were rare in this region of space, and intelligent ones were rarer still. The pieces were starting to come together, painting a picture that was far more interesting than a simple dead world. As the team continued forward into the forest, Victoria maintained heightened alert status. They moved in defensive formation, their hands near their weapons but not yet drawn. She had learned long ago that the first contact between species was always the most critical. One wrong move, one act of aggression, and what could have been a beautiful friendship could transform into conflict in seconds. She had seen it happen before, and she was determined to avoid repeating those mistakes. The clearing opened before them suddenly, and the team halted. There was evidence of habitation here, a camp of sorts with signs of recent activity, scattered bones from meals, a makeshift shelter beneath a large tree, tools that had clearly been crafted by intelligent hands. Victoria's heart began to race with excitement. There was intelligent life here. There was an advanced civilization that had not abandoned their world as the record suggested. Someone or something had stayed behind. Behind them there was a sound, not loud but distinct enough to be noticeable. A low rumble that seemed to come from multiple sources, forming harmonies that Victoria's brain struggled to process. She had heard many sounds from many creatures across many worlds, but never anything quite like this. Lieutenant Webb immediately drew his weapon, but Victoria held up her hand again, this time with more urgency. Then she saw the movement in the trees. Two shapes emerging from the shadows, their scales catching the fading light and shimmering with colors that seemed to shift and dance. Dragons. Actual dragons. Creatures that most humans thought existed only in ancient mythology and entertainment media. They were smaller than Victoria would have expected, perhaps no larger than large dogs. But there was an undeniable intelligence and grace in their movements. They moved like cats stalking prey, their eyes fixed on the human team with an intensity that suggested they were assessing threat levels and tactical advantages. Victoria did something that made her entire team tense. She slowly lowered her weapon, removed the tactical gear that might appear threatening, and took a single step forward, her hands visible and open at her sides. The message was clear and unmistakable: I mean you no harm. I come in peace. The golden dragon tilted its head, studying her with what appeared to be intense curiosity. The darker one beside it made a sound, something between a chirp and a growl, and they both moved deeper into the clearing. They were not attacking. They were not fleeing. They were leading Victoria and her team somewhere, and she understood immediately that whoever had sent these creatures wanted to meet her face to face. Following the dragons felt like stepping into a dream. They led the team upward, along a path that wound through the dying forest until they reached higher ground with a view of the surrounding landscape. And there, standing silhouetted against the grayish sky, was a figure that made Victoria stop in her tracks. An elf. Not a legend, not a myth, but a real, living, breathing elf woman. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair that seemed to glow with its own light. Her eyes were a brilliant blue that reflected intelligence and caution in equal measure. She wore armor that seemed to be made from a combination of organic and inorganic materials. Materials that Victoria's mind could not immediately classify. Her hand rested on a sword at her side, and there was a readiness in her posture that suggested she knew how to use it. For a long moment, neither party moved. The two dragons settled on either side of the elf woman, their eyes never leaving the human team. Victoria could feel her team members tensing behind her, waiting for her next move, waiting for orders. But Victoria was transfixed. In all her years of exploration and all the strange and wonderful things she had encountered across the stars, she had never seen anything quite like this. This was first contact with something truly remarkable, something that would change how humanity understood the universe. Victoria raised her hand slightly higher, a gesture of complete non-aggression. She then slowly brought her hand to her side and activated the universal translator, the device that could convert between most known languages and communication systems. It would not work perfectly, not for a language so old and possibly so unique, but it was the best tool she had for initiating communication. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and filled with genuine respect. She introduced herself and her team. She explained that her people came from distant stars. She expressed that her mission was one of exploration and discovery, not conquest or exploitation, and most importantly, she conveyed that she was there to help if help was needed, that humanity was capable of more than just destruction. The elf woman did not respond immediately. She studied Victoria for a long moment, her eyes searching, evaluating, trying to determine if these words were truth or deception. The dragons beside her remained perfectly still, but Victoria could sense them processing the interaction, gathering information, preparing to react if necessary. Finally, the elf woman took a single step forward, and Victoria understood that the most important conversation of her entire life was about to begin. The conversation that followed was unlike anything either Lyra or Victoria had ever experienced. The translator device worked better than either of them expected, converting Lyra's ancient elf language into human speech with surprising accuracy. Lyra spoke first. her voice carrying the weight of centuries and the exhaustion of someone who had been alone for far too long. She asked the question that mattered most. Why had the humans come to Aelendor, and what did they intend to do with what they found? Victoria answered with careful honesty. She explained that her people had evolved beyond the need for conquest and exploitation. They had learned that true advancement came through understanding, through cooperation, through building relationships with other civilizations rather than destroying them. The Human Federation had spent decades developing technology and philosophy that allowed them to explore space without causing harm. Victoria's specific mission was to find worlds in crisis and offer solutions, not demands. She was searching for situations where human knowledge and technology could help restore what was being lost, without erasing the identity and culture of the civilizations that already existed on those worlds. Lyra listened carefully, her blue eyes searching Victoria's face for signs of deception. She had spent 473 years learning to read people, to understand truth from falsehood, to sense the intentions hidden behind words. What she saw in Victoria was genuine. There was no hidden agenda, no carefully concealed lust for power or resources. There was only a woman who genuinely believed that humanity could be better, that cooperation was more valuable than conquest. Over the next 3 days, Lyra and Victoria did something that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. They talked. They shared. They opened themselves to each other in ways that transcended cultural boundaries and species differences. Victoria learned about the history of Aelendor, about the great civilizations that had once flourished there, about the magical systems that had powered elf society for thousands of years. Lyra learned about humanity, about their struggles and achievements, about their capacity for both destruction and creation. Ember and Ash warmed to Victoria quickly. The captain had a natural way with the dragons, spending hours learning their behaviors, their personalities, their preferences. She discovered that Ember was more playful and curious, while Ash was more protective and serious. Victoria treated them with respect, never attempting to control them or assert dominance, and they responded by becoming increasingly affectionate. By the 3rd day, Ash would rest her head on Victoria's lap, while Ember would perch on her shoulder. Dr. Vasquez proved invaluable during these 3 days. She conducted extensive environmental scans and analysis, determining the exact nature of the damage to Aelendor's ecosystem. What she found was both devastating and promising. The damage was indeed extensive, but the fundamental systems that had once made Aelendor habitable were still present at their core. They had been suppressed and weakened, but not destroyed. With the right intervention, with the right combination of technology and magic, the world could be restored. On the 3rd evening, Victoria made a proposal that changed everything. She suggested a partnership. What if they combined human technology with elf magic? What if they worked together to restore Aelendor to its former glory? Lyra could use her connection to the land, her understanding of the magical networks that had once sustained her world, to guide where and how the restoration should take place. Victoria's team could provide the technology to amplify those magical effects, to accelerate the healing process far beyond what either species could achieve alone. Lyra asked the hard question. Why would Victoria and her people help a dying world? What was in it for them? Victoria's answer was simple but profound. The universe was vast and cold and often hostile. If humanity wanted to build a future where their species was not alone, where they had allies and partners among the stars, they had to prove that they could be trusted. They had to show that when they found a civilization in need, they would reach out with open hands rather than weapons. That night, Lyra made a decision that would alter the course of both human and elf history. She agreed to Victoria's proposal. She would accept help. She would allow humans to work on Aelendor. She would put her trust in this remarkable woman and her people. It was a risk. There was always the possibility that this was an elaborate deception, that humans would betray her the moment her guard was lowered. But Lyra had learned something crucial in her long life. The greatest achievements always required the greatest risks. The next morning, Victoria sent transmissions back to her command center. She requested additional equipment, additional personnel, and specialists in environmental restoration. She requested permission to undertake one of the most ambitious restoration projects humanity had ever attempted. She explained the situation, the opportunity and the potential for creating something unprecedented, a true alliance between human and elf civilization. The response came back within hours. Permission granted. Additional resources would be en route within the week. Humanity's leadership had apparently decided that this moment was worth the investment. Lyra watched from a high vantage point as Victoria coordinated with her team, as plans were made and strategies discussed. The elf woman felt something she had not felt in decades: hope. Ember and Ash seemed to sense the change in mood. They became more active and playful, chasing each other through the forest with a joy that had been absent before. They seemed to understand that something significant was happening, that their lives were about to be transformed. Lyra wondered what her ancestors would think of this. Would they see it as betrayal? An elf woman working with humans after so many centuries of avoidance and fear? Or would they see it as evolution, as the only possible future for civilizations that wanted to survive? She did not have answers to those questions. But as she watched Victoria and her team working to prepare Elendor for the restoration effort, as she felt the first real hope in her ancient heart, Lyra knew that she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face, at least they would face them together. And that, Lyra realized, made all the difference. The restoration of Elendor began with a single gesture. Lyra and Victoria stood together in the center of what had once been the heart of power, the location where the magical networks of the entire elf civilization had been concentrated. It was now little more than a barren wasteland, with only a few remnants of the crystal towers that had once powered the whole world. The ancient crystals were dark and lifeless, drained of the energy that had sustained them for millennia. Victoria's team had set up equipment all around the perimeter of the heart. It was advanced technology, machines that could measure and manipulate environmental factors on a scale that would have seemed like magic to any observer, not trained in human science. But Lyra understood the principle behind it. It was not so different from elf magic in its fundamentals. Both systems worked by understanding the natural laws of the universe, and then finding ways to work within those laws more efficiently, more effectively. Lyra placed her hand on the largest of the dead crystals and closed her eyes. She could still feel the faintest pulse of magic within it. Like a heart that had nearly stopped but was not quite dead, she began to sing. It was not a song in any conventional sense. Rather, it was a series of tones and frequencies that resonated through her body and into the crystal, awakening the ancient elf magic that slumbered within its structure. As she sang, the crystal began to glow with a faint blue light. Victoria watched from her command station, monitoring the readings as Lyra worked. The environmental sensors were showing a response. The magic was resonating with the technology, creating harmonies that amplified both systems. It was working exactly as they had theorized it would work. She gave the signal for the next phase to begin. Ember and Ash circled overhead, their wings beating in patterns that seemed to follow the rhythm of Lyra's song. The dragons breathed their elemental fire not downward toward the ground but outward in spiraling patterns, creating columns of flame that danced around the heart of power. This was not random fire. This was intentional, controlled, part of the restoration process. The dragon fire had properties that elf magic alone could not replicate. It carried transformative energy that could burn away corruption and decay, while leaving healthy systems untouched. As the morning progressed, more and more crystals awakened. The glow spread from the heart of power outward in concentric circles, moving through the dead landscape like sunrise spreading across a sleeping world. Where the magic touched, the land responded. Cracks in the earth sealed themselves. Dust that had blown barren for decades began to settle and transform into fertile soil. The first small shoots of green growth appeared, testing their way upward through the revitalized ground. By midday, the first major change became visible to the naked eye. A spring that had run dry for 50 years suddenly burst back to life, water flowing clear and pure from beneath the earth. The sound of the water, the sight of it, made something break open in Lyra's heart. She had not realized how much she had been holding on to despair until she saw proof that hope was not futile. Victoria brought the team together that night to celebrate the first day's progress. The environmental readings showed measurable improvement across the entire scanning radius. If they could maintain this pace, if the magic and technology continued to work in harmony, they could restore the entire world in a matter of weeks instead of months or years. It was more progress than anyone had anticipated. Over the following weeks, the pattern established itself. Each day, Lyra and Victoria would coordinate their efforts. Each day, the land would heal a little more. The dragons became essential to the process. As they grew stronger from breathing the increasingly healthier air, their fire became more potent, more useful in the restoration work. They seemed to understand their role in the grand plan, and they threw themselves into their work with the dedication of creatures who knew they were part of something larger than themselves. Other changes began to happen too. Word had spread through the hidden elf communities that something extraordinary was happening. Lyra's people, the ones who had thought Aelendor completely lost, began to emerge from their underground shelters and mountain retreats. At first, they were suspicious of the human presence. Many of them still believed the ancient stories of humans as destroyers. But as they watched humans and elves working side by side to restore their world, as they saw the land coming back to life, attitudes shifted. An old elf named Cairn approached Lyra one evening. He had been a scholar before the decline, a keeper of ancient knowledge, and he had survived by hiding in the deepest caverns beneath the world. When he saw what was happening, he wept openly. He told Lyra that he had spent centuries thinking the Age of Wonders had ended. He never thought he would see the day when cooperation between species could achieve what seemed impossible. He asked permission to join the restoration effort, to use what knowledge he still possessed to help guide the process. Victoria's team grew as well. More humans arrived as word spread through the Federation about the unprecedented alliance taking place on Aelendor. Engineers, biologists, magical theorists, people from a dozen different human colonies all came to be part of something historic. The camp that had started with just a few people had grown into a small city of tents and temporary structures. Tensions arose occasionally. Some humans were suspicious of magic, not understanding it, fearing what they could not quantify scientifically. Some elves remained wary of human intentions, certain that there was some hidden agenda they had not yet uncovered. But Victoria and Lyra worked constantly to bridge these gaps, to build understanding, to remind everyone that they were working toward a common goal. 3 weeks into the restoration effort, something remarkable happened. The sky began to clear. The perpetual gray that had covered Aelendor for so long started to fade, revealing glimpses of the brilliant emerald hue that the ancient records described. When the elves saw that clear emerald sky for the first time in generations, they celebrated with tears of joy. When the humans saw it, they understood why their elf allies loved this world so much, why Lyra had fought so hard to preserve it. Lyra stood with Victoria on the highest point of the healing world, watching as ember and ash played in the now clean air. The elf woman reached out and took Victoria's hand, a gesture that meant more than words could convey. It meant trust. It meant friendship. It meant that two very different species had found common ground and had chosen to build something beautiful together. The final phase of the restoration took place under an increasingly clear sky. The emerald light that had once defined Aelendor's atmosphere had returned completely, and with it came a transformation in the very spirit of the place. Where there had been decay and desolation, there was now vibrant life. Forests grew not in weeks but in days, accelerated by the combined power of elf magic and human technology. Rivers that had been dry for generations flowed full and strong. Animals began to return, creatures that had retreated to hidden refuges emerging to reclaim their natural habitats. Lyra had been the central figure in this entire effort. Her magic was the guiding force that directed where and how the restoration should proceed. She could feel the land's wounds with an intimacy that only an ancient elf could possess. She knew which areas needed gentle healing and which needed more aggressive intervention. She understood the balance between restoration and forcing change too quickly. Under her guidance, Aelendor was not just being restored to its former state. It was being improved, refined, made better than it had been before the decline. Victoria had become something like Lyra's counterpart, the human face of the restoration effort. She managed logistics, coordinated between the different teams, and served as a bridge between human and elf perspectives. More than that, she had become Lyra's closest friend and trusted advisor. The two women spent hours together each day, not always working, sometimes simply talking and sharing their thoughts and dreams. They had formed a bond that transcended the typical relationships between military commanders or colleagues. They had become sisters in spirit, if not in blood. 1 month into the intensive restoration phase, Cairn made a discovery in the archives he had been working to restore. He found ancient texts that described the true nature of the decline that had gripped Aelendor centuries ago. It was not a natural disaster or a simple depletion of resources. It was the result of elf civilization becoming too isolated, too convinced of their own superiority, too afraid of change and outside influence. The decline had been a slow descent into stagnation, and it had taken the arrival of humans with fresh perspectives and different technologies to break the cycle. When Lyra learned this truth, it affected her deeply. She realized that her refusal to abandon her world, while admirable in its devotion, might have been part of the problem. Sometimes survival meant accepting help. Sometimes preservation meant allowing change. Sometimes strength came not from resisting transformation but from embracing it. She shared these thoughts with Victoria, and the human woman simply smiled and said that this was wisdom that all civilizations had to learn eventually. By the second month, the restoration was essentially complete. The environmental readings showed that Aelendor was now healthier than it had been in centuries. The magical networks had been fully awakened and were functioning at levels that surpassed what even the ancient elf scholars had believed was possible. The combination of human and elf knowledge had created systems that were more resilient, more efficient, more beautiful than what had existed before. But the most remarkable change happened to the dragons. As Aelendor's environment healed, as the magic in the air grew stronger and more abundant, Ember and Ash began to grow. Not just in physical size, though that was certainly happening. They were transforming at a fundamental level, becoming the magnificent creatures that dragons were meant to be. Their scales took on colors that seemed to shift between gold and emerald and sapphire as the light caught them. Their wings grew strong enough to carry them high into the atmosphere. They developed the ability to communicate with both humans and elves in ways that had not been possible before. Ember was the first to speak in a language that both species could understand. Her voice was like music and thunder combined, a sound that seemed to resonate from the very core of the world. She expressed gratitude to both Lyra and Victoria, and in her gratitude was an understanding that transcended simple awareness. She and Ash had become something more than simple animal companions. They had become sapient beings, sentient creatures worthy of recognition and respect. The elf communities that had emerged from hiding held a great gathering at the heart of power, now fully restored and shining with the ancient light. They welcomed the humans as honored guests and as partners in their civilization's rebirth. Victoria and her team were offered places of honor and respect. Plans were discussed for ongoing cooperation, for the exchange of knowledge and culture, for the beginning of a new era in which elf and human civilizations could grow together rather than apart. Lyra stood before the assembled crowd of both species and told her story. She explained how despair had turned to hope, how she had believed her world and her people were lost until she opened herself to the possibility of change and connection. She spoke about Victoria's courage in approaching an unknown world with peaceful intentions. She spoke about the dragons and their transformation from lost hatchlings to noble sentience. She spoke about how the universe seemed vast and uncaring until you found others willing to stand beside you, willing to share your burdens, willing to believe in the possibility of a better future. After the formal ceremonies concluded, Lyra and Victoria found themselves alone on a high cliff overlooking the newly restored forest of Aelendor. The emerald sky spread above them like a vast cathedral ceiling. Ember and Ash rested nearby, their massive forms no longer intimidating but comforting in their presence. This was a moment of peace, a moment of completion, a moment that seemed somehow outside of time. Victoria told Lyra that she had received communication from the Human Federation about next steps. There were other worlds in crisis, other civilizations facing extinction that might benefit from the model they had created here on Aelendor. She was being offered the opportunity to lead more restoration missions, to spread the message that cooperation between species was not only possible, but beneficial to all involved. She asked Lyra if she would join her. Lyra did not answer immediately. She thought about her duty to her people, about her responsibilities to Aelendor, but she also thought about the vast universe beyond her world, about all the civilizations out there facing challenges similar to what she had faced. She thought about Ember and Ash, who had already proven they could adapt and thrive in new situations. She thought about the friendship and love she had found with Victoria, about how that connection had changed her fundamentally. She took Victoria's hand and said that she would go, not abandoning her world but trusting that it was now healthy enough to thrive without her constant presence, not abandoning her people, but bringing their gifts and their wisdom to a universe that desperately needed what they had to offer. It was a new kind of guardianship, one that extended beyond a single world to encompass all civilizations in need. As the sun set over the restored forests, painting the emerald sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lyra finally understood that her greatest adventure was just beginning. She was no longer just the last guardian of a dying world. She was a bridge between worlds, a symbol of what was possible when species dared to trust one another.